They found an antenna or something on a mountain. Apparently there was somebody that survived the crash that took an object out and put it up on a mountain in order to communicate. All alien crafts were stored at Groom Lake Air Force Base in Nevada after the crash. Although the document was eventually released, it was heavily redacted and of such poor quality, but it did verify that Roswell incident was a crash UFO. Hello, my name is Richard Doty. I'm a former intelligence officer with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Today, we're going to talk about the Roswell incident. How I learned about the Roswell incident, what I learned about the Roswell incident, and who told me about the Roswell incident. We're going to discuss that in details today. In June of 1979, I was stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base as a counterintelligence officer with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. I was investigating an incident that involved a UFO over Kirtland Air Force Base. This investigation allowed me to be briefed into a special access program, which involves the U.S. government's knowledge of UFOs and extraterrestrial beings visiting Earth. The briefing was held at the Air Force Special Security Office inside the Air Force Weapons Laboratory on Kirtland Air Force Base West. The briefing was named Project Aquarius. The Special Access Program code was 9Q-17061. That was the actual code for the briefing. I remember it because it was still on a document that I had in my possession. The briefing was given by an Air Force colonel. The briefing began with a chronological history of the U.S. government's involvement with extraterrestrial visitors to Earth. Ironically, the briefing starts with the Roswell incident of 1947. The briefing contained the following. July 1947, an archaeological team from the University of New Mexico discovered a strange object on the ground near a small ravine southeast of Corona, New Mexico. The team located a live creature that appeared to be a non-human at the site. There were 5 other creatures, but all were dead. The team had to drive several miles to a ranch in Corona, New Mexico, in order to find a telephone to notify authorities. Remember, this is 1947, a remote area of central New Mexico. Very few phones existed back in those days, and they were few and far between. Eventually, a Lincoln County Sheriff's deputy and a New Mexico State Police officer responded to the scene the next morning. So eventually, a convoy from Roswell Army Airfield responded to the scene. This convoy was led by Captain Robert Daimler. He was the actual captain coming from Roswell Army Airfield to the site. We know this because some very smart researchers, including Bill Moore, found this out. The name was never released until probably 5 or 6 years ago. During the same time period, another crash site was located farther south of the first site. A rancher by the name of Brazel located debris. Unknown to Brazel that the Army was already notified, he took the debris to Chaves County Sheriff's Office in Roswell, which in turn notified the Army. Major Jesse Marcel, a counterintelligence officer for Roswell Army Air Base, responded to the Brazel crash site. These 2 crash sites were close proximity, a few miles apart. Eventually, Major Marcel coordinated with Captain Daimler on the recovery of both these crash sites. The debris was taken to Roswell Army Airfield and stored in a hangar. The craft found at the first site was taken to Roswell Army Airfield but stored in a separate location. Now, this is a controversy. There's been probably, I know of at least 30 books written about the Roswell incident. The first book was, of course, written by William Moore, and it contained some very good information about what happened at the Roswell site. But all these books only talk about the debris field, or where the debris was found in the Roswell Ranch, and not the actual craft that was found by the archaeological team. The scientist in charge of the archaeological team gave an interview in an Albuquerque newspaper in December of 1947, but nobody, or very few people, ever even read that. The only person that did an investigation into that archaeological team was Stan Friedman. Dr. Stan Friedman was intimately involved with the UFO phenomena, wrote books about it. He was a physicist himself. He was originally from Canada. Great friends of the UFO community. Unfortunately, he died a couple years ago. But Stan talked to relatives of the archaeological team leader. He also found some of the archaeological team members still alive. Remember, this is 47. It was a class. Some of these class members were only 19, 20, 21 years old, college students. So they were still alive when he first looked them up in the 90s. They told him the story. The first question he asked was, why didn't you go out and spread this around? I mean, you found an alien craft and nobody talked about it? Their response, we were warned not to talk about it. Stan said, by the Army? He said, yes. We were told that it was a secret craft, and if we were to tell anyone, we would be prosecuted, or we might be found dead in the desert. Now, we heard these stories about other people trying to report the Roswell incident. Family members of the sheriff of Chaves County and other people. So, what's the story? What's real and what's fiction? Well, this briefing that I'm receiving is telling the truth. It's defying a lot of information that's in the books written about UFOs, about Roswell, about the incident at Corona, about the incident at Pelona Peak, south of Dattle. But I'm listening to this briefing, and I'm getting the story directly from the government and not from a book. The second counterintelligence officer came from Kirtland Air Force Base and assisted in the recovery of the bodies. Now remember, the first one was Major Marcel. He came from Roswell. The second one came from Kirtland Air Force Base, which was Kirtland Army Airfield at the time. He was an Army counterintelligence officer just like Marcel was, but he was a captain. The bodies and live alien were transported to Los Alamos laboratories since they had a cryogenic chamber for storing the dead. Now, Roswell was a very sophisticated Army Air Force base at that time. It contained a 509th Bomb Wing, which was the only Army Air Corps fighter wing in the Air Force in the nation that could drop atomic bombs. Remember, in 1945, we tested a bomb in the desert, not far from Roswell, the Trinity site. And then, of course, in wartime, we dropped 2 atomic bombs by the 509 over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. So we had these planes, these 509 bombers, on alert at Roswell. So it was a very sensitive base. Los Alamos National Laboratories, or back in those days called Los Alamos Laboratories, was a very secretive location. They're the ones that built the bomb. And it was a very secure site. So that's why the ET bodies were transported to Los Alamos. The entire recovery operation was filmed by a U.S. Army photographic team from White Sands Army Base, which again was close to the site. The chief photographer was a Sergeant Rusty Nercola, N-E-R-C-O-L-A. We know his name because Stan Friedman obtained it. The team took still and motion pictures of the recovery operation from July 11th through July 25th of 1947. And I'm actually looking at one of those recovery films during this briefing. Most of the pictures were taken at the site where the intact craft was found, not at the debris field. The pictures were taken where the craft was or where the archaeological team found it. All photographs were detailed in a Major Bill Rickett, he was a counterintelligence officer's report titled Field Operations Report 20 July 1947, IR 0031. That's the actual counterintelligence report written about the recovery at Roswell. And I got this from the recovery film. It's the real report. Now, where's that report today? Many people, including Stan Friedman, William Moore, and others, tried to get that from the government. The government says it doesn't exist. It says that the IR number 0031 pertained to a weather balloon incident that happened over Carlsbad, New Mexico in 1949. But we were able to go back and find some intelligence logs, which we got through FOIA, which showed the numbering system for field operation reports, which are conducted by counterintelligence officers, were properly numbered the way Bill Rickett did it. So I think the government's trying to hide something. Now, having worked in intelligence and working in counterintelligence, some people might say, well, that's disinformation. Yeah, the government tried to deceive the public by telling us and other researchers that, no, that's the wrong field operations report number. During this briefing, the live alien was housed at Los Alamos and controlled by the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Scientists associated with the investigation of this event and working for the U.S. government surmised that the crash of the alien craft was caused by military radar interfering with the flight operations of the alien craft. Now, there's a lot of people out there, scientists especially, saying, wait a minute, this alien craft flies 37 or 38 light years to Earth, and lightning affects it? Well, yes, some smart scientists, including Dr. 𝗩𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗘, would say there's a possibility that there's no such thing as lightning on their planet. They would not have any idea what lightning was, nor would they make any type of effort to prevent lightning from hurting their craft. How would they prevent something if they didn't know about it? So New Mexico does have very severe lightning storms. I live in New Mexico, I've seen them. And in 1947, it was recorded that there was a very serious lightning storm in the beginning of July, later June and into July of 1947. So these two crafts were flying over New Mexico during that time period, and they were both hit by lightning. It might have disrupted their equipment, caused their systems, avionics, to go haywire. And one crashed near Corona, the other one crashed out near Pelona Peak, south of Daddle in western New Mexico. This briefing continued with this information. In 1949, while moving cattle from one range to another, Albert Riley located a strange-looking object near the Pelona Mountain, south of Dallas, New Mexico. The rancher eventually reported the object to the Catron County Sheriffs 1 week later. Now, where this incident happened is an extremely remote area of western New Mexico. There were no phones, obviously no cell phones. The only way to communicate is by driving to certain locations where there were phones, calling the authorities, and then the authorities were sometimes hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and it could take them, as did this incident, weeks to get to the site. Eventually, the Catron County Sheriff arrived at the location 10 days later. He took a photograph of the object and traveled back to Reserve, New Mexico, where his office was located, and called the United States Air Force at Sandia Base, which was in Albuquerque. 16 days later, a convoy of U.S. Air Force vehicles arrived at the crash site on Pelona Mountain. Jose Marco and Maria Armendez were ranch workers who stayed at the site until the military arrived. How do we know this? Because we found it in the report. What report? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it's a report that Stan Friedman eventually found. The U.S. Air Force recovered an intact craft identical to the craft found at Corona. Now remember, this is 2 years later. We found the craft, they did, in Corona in 1947. They took it to Los Alamos and eventually on to other places for analysis. Now, 2 years later, in 1949, we found an identical craft at Pelona. Everything was the same. Unfortunately, the bodies recovered at the Pelona site were all dead and decayed, because this was 2 years later. But the bodies were the exact same of the bodies of the creatures that we found. I'm talking about the U.S. government, found in Corona. The bodies were transported to Los Alamos, where they were stored, and eventually on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where advanced research was done. After the initial recovery phase, a radiological assessment team from Los Alamos and the Atomic Energy Commission performed a thorough search of the area for possible radiation contamination. Back in those days, we thought that any type of propulsion system used by an exotic technology such as an alien would have to be radiological, would have to be some kind of nuclear material. The team also discovered a device that was planted in the soil on a high peak near the crash site. And this was something exciting to the scientists. It was believed that after the craft crashed in 1947, survivors planted a device, possibly antenna, that could have been used to signal another alien craft. The device was recovered and sent to Los Alamos Laboratory. Now, this was the crash site in Pelona, the second crash site that was found in 1947. They found an antenna or something on a mountain. So apparently there was somebody that survived the crash that took an object out and put it up on a mountain in order to communicate. There are a lot of other parts of the briefing that was detailed, such as the conclusion as to why the two alien crafts crashed. Science reasoned, as I said earlier, that during the time the two crafts were flying over New Mexico, a violent thunderstorm occurred, lightning was present, and the lightning affected the mechanical operation of these two crafts. The briefing also detailed other crash UFO recoveries in New Mexico, Nevada, and Arizona, and even one in Utah. All alien crafts were stored at Groom Lake Air Force Base in Nevada after the crash. So we knew of other crash sites. It's detailed in my briefing. Over the years, hundreds of books have been written about Roswell, UFOs, what happened in New Mexico, mysterious events occurring in New Mexico. Most are based on speculation, third-party witness statements, or the conclusion of the U.S. Air Force investigation accomplished in 1996, which classified the Roswell incident as a hoax and that the crash actually involved weather balloons, a Project Mogul. The U.S. Air Force claimed the recovery at Corona was part of a weather and surveillance balloon operation under Project Mogul. Most detailed researchers found that the Project Mogul balloons were all accounted for during the month of June of 1947. The notion that the bodies found at Corona were dummies used by the Air Force for parachute testing was a hoax by the Air Force, because the U.S. Air Force didn't exist in June of 1947. The 1996 statement by Colonel Richard Weaver, who I used to work for, claimed that the bodies, these dummies, were U.S. Air Force property. Well, first of all, the Air Force was created under the National Security Act in 1947. And it didn't actually exist as an operating agency until 1948. The U.S. Air Force dummy program didn't start until 1954. So Colonel Richard Weaver, who authored the report, Roswell Case Closed, he was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Counterintelligence Division. Colonel Weaver was responsible for conducting disinformation programs for the Air Force. Why do I know that? I worked for Colonel Weaver in the late 70s. I worked on operations with Colonel Weaver. The U.S. Air Force investigations of this event was all something done to misinform the public and close the case on Roswell. They were tired of receiving FOIA requests. They were tired of answering questions about Roswell. So they decided, let's just get this over with. Let's blame it on Project Mogul. Project Mogul, the chief scientist in Project Mogul, readily admitted that the June Mogul balloon launchings and recovery were all accounted for. There wasn't any missing balloons. UFO investigators like Stan Friedman and William Moore conducted a great investigation of the Roswell incident. They answered a lot of these questions back in the 70s and 80s. And Roswell was always on the mind of the late Stan Friedman, even after that. The investigators interviewed real people, obtained real FOIA documents, including Major Bill Rickett's Field Investigations Report, the IR Report 0031. Although the document was eventually released, it was heavily redacted and of such poor quality, but it did verify that Roswell incident was a crashed UFO, not a weather balloon. This information was never placed in a report or a book because Stan was still trying to verify a lot of facts before he died. Bill Moore lost interest in the subject. He gave a presentation in 1979, ending his involvement with UFOs. And there was so much pressure on other investigators within the UFO community about the Roswell incident that they decided to move on, investigate something else. But there's a lot of people out there, and a lot of UFO investigators, a lot of people that are still extremely interested in Roswell and what happened at Roswell. We know a lot about Roswell because I was briefed, as was, I know 122 other Air Force OS agents were briefed in the same program as I was, Project Aquarius. So they know what happened at Roswell. They had the truth. Unfortunately, the Air Force is denying it. They're still disinforming the public. It's harmful to society. Why not tell the truth about Roswell? And then tell the truth in a way that we can call it case closed. Maybe someday that will happen. This concludes my presentation on Roswell. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that you'll have a lot of questions. I'm Richard Doty. Thank you.
If you like this video and you want to see more amazing content, go ahead and check out the next video on our channel.